My name is Jennifer Lovett. I am a second-year master's student in the Conservation Biology program at Antioch University, New England. This presentation will highlight one of the projects I have worked on this spring in my internship at One World Conservation Center in Bennington, Vermont. My ultimate goal is to become a nature interpreter or naturalist at a place like the One World Conservation Center. Most of my projects, both this spring and last summer, have been conducted in the field. I am currently completing a species inventory of a kettle pond at One World Conservation Center, which was the focus of my summer internship. I am also studying the resident beaver colony and preparing interpretive materials related to the beavers and their habitat. The project that I will now discuss has been somewhat challenging for me because it is more policy-oriented and not focused on hands-on field work. It consists of creating a 3 to 5 year strategic plan for interpretation at this reserve, with the goal of confronting and resolving several programming problems that have become evident. The project was assigned to me by Bruce Evie, director of One World Conservation Center, and my internship supervisor. Bruce would like to see a more organized, structured, consistent, and multi-layered approach to interpretation. Program planning at One World Conservation Center is hindered by the limited size of the staff, which is skeletal. Consequently, programming is haphazard and dependent on volunteers and occasional interns who often have little background or experience. The hope is that by creating a sensible plan from soup to nuts, initial objectives through final evaluations, we will be able to obtain funding that will allow us to implement an effective and professional range of programs. This slide shows the building we call the Education Center. It is located on a major road, Route 7, just south of the center of Bennington, Vermont. The building was originally a Howard Johnson's restaurant, and it still contains vestiges of that identity, the most obvious being the trademark orange roof. A major challenge for One World Conservation Center is that the Education Center is across the road from the nature reserve, and many people never enter the building when they visit the site. One of the goals for the interpretation plan will be to strengthen the connection and unify the property so that visitors will cross the road and extend their visit into the Education Center. This is the interior of the Education Center. It is basically a large open space that is used for multiple functions. The space contains offices, some wall exhibits related to the reserve and local area, tropical plants, some research resources like guidebooks and a public access computer, a children's corner, and a rack holding our discovery packs. These are thematic backpacks filled with resources aimed at specific topics like bird watching that are available for visitors to borrow and take out with them to the reserve. There is also a large open space where public lectures and meetings are held. The building is not particularly welcoming or cozy and needs to be made more user-friendly, as well as more overtly connected to the reserve on the other side of the street. This is one of the trail maps. It provides an overview of the 97-acre nature reserve. There are several trails through and around the meadow, wetlands, and forest stands. This map is not current, and there is an additional longer trail that loops through the forest. In addition to the physical problem of the Education Center being on the opposite side of a very busy road from the land reserve, there is some confusion about the name of this property. Founded in 1991, this nonprofit organization was originally known as the New England Tropical Conservatory. It consisted of the Education Center and the reserve acreage called the Norman and Selma Greenberg Nature Reserve. About 2 years ago, the name was changed to the One World Conservation Center. At the entrance to the reserve, where visitors often park their cars, it is marked on either side by 2 large boulders inscribed with the names of New England Tropical Conservatory and the Greenberg Conservation Reserve. The Education Center has a large sign outside the entrance that says One World Conservation Center. So, from the signage, it is not at all clear that these 2 places are one and the same. This 97-acre property contains a meadow, wetlands, shrublands, a beaver pond, 3 forest stands, and a kettle pond. This slide shows the meadow from the parking lot. The property was used for subsistence and sheep farming fairly consistently from its initial charter in 1763 until the early 20th century, when it was converted to a dairy farm and ultimately used for hayfields. The nature reserve was created in 2003 when the Greenberg family sold the property to New England Tropical Conservatory. There is quite a bit of historical evidence reflecting the property's past uses, including a very old and impressive sugar bush, beaver meadows, a stone sheep paddock within the Kettle Pond, several old wells, stone walls, and a buttonbush swamp. The next 4 slides show views of the reserve. This is another view of the meadow with the old farm road, which is now a path. This is the wetland with shrub habitat in the background. This is the Beaver Pond. And this is the footbridge that has a beaver dam below it and a beaver baffle on the riverside to keep the beavers from flooding the trail. When I was first asked to create a plan for interpretation of the reserve, I began by reading several texts on the subject. These are the books I found most helpful. I started the brainstorming process by asking myself questions and developing answers. Some of the broader questions that needed to be addressed were pretty straightforward. Why do we need to interpret? Who is interpretation for? What should the focus be? How will it be designed and accomplished, and by whom? And how will it finally be evaluated? This is a slide showing my brainstorming outline. I decided to start with the mission statement, which remarkably had just been rewritten this spring by the Board of Directors. It reads, "To provide nature education and experience grounded in our local ecology and linked to global biodiversity." This became the umbrella under which all interpretive programs would lie. Next, I created a questionnaire that will be sent to all members of the center and is available to visitors as well. Later this summer, the responses will be collected, analyzed, and incorporated into the final plan. The questions are aimed at profiling the visitors, their demographics, as well as their interests, experiences, and reactions to their visits to this reserve. I began compiling and identifying themes and programs and fitting them into a chart that identifies various methods of interpretation, from signage to tours and exhibits. Some of these programs exist now, but many, actually most, are new initiatives. I feel that interpretation needs to be provocative, inspirational, and that it should stimulate an audience to want to discover more on their own. It should provoke visitors to want to pursue their own inquiries. This can be done in 2 ways. First is non-personal and consists of signage, texts, brochures, websites, and things like this. The second is more personal and would be composed of walks, talks, demos, camps, basically person-to-person contact. The ultimate scenario will have to be a combination of the 2 approaches. This slide shows an active beaver lodge that will be visible from the Beaver Walk platform that will be constructed this summer. I will be writing the didactic labels and signage that will be a part of this project. So here, my field work and interpretation policy project merge quite comfortably. This is the Kettle Pond, a somewhat fragile habitat that lends itself to interpretation in the Education Center, where the interesting relationship between the land use history and the evolution of the site into a buttonbush swamp can be explained. This slide shows part of the forest that really serves as a background for much of the reserve and will serve as a backdrop for this section of my talk. The background reading for this project provided a great deal of insights into how levels of visitor services and needs can vary. The more diverse, as well as dynamic, the information provided to visitors is, the more successful the programs tend to be. While the management goals are to protect the reserve, protect the visitors, and to promote the agency, One World Conservation Center, the interpretive goals are to increase the involvement and enjoyment of our visitors. We desire to engage them with nature, with the inherent historical as well as ecological value of the site, and to inspire them to learn more on their own. Ultimately, we want them to become invested stewards, supporters, and advocates of this property. As I mentioned earlier, the strategic plan will be covered by the conceptual umbrella of the mission statement. It will consist of clear objectives and targets, specific themes, content, methods, and media, identified costs and sources of funding, schedules and priorities, responsibilities related to program implementation, management, training, and staffing, and finally, evaluation of the success of programs. This is an example of something we want to improve. These signs, now in the reserve, are crudely made, falling apart, and stylistically inconsistent. An important goal will be to discover what is the missing link between the reserve and the education center. The connection between the two should be reinforced through programs that tie the resources of the education center to the various focal points in the reserve. Through diverse types of interpretive programs, we will create a dynamic flow back and forth between the two entities. My final task will be to create a training handbook, manual, and guide for interpreters. This will ensure that everyone conducting programs in the reserve will be on the same page and will have a solid foundation. In order to be effective, interpreters must know the resources, the site history, and have some knowledge of topical issues like climate change. At One World Conservation Center, there is an added incentive to engage and inspire our visitors. There is the potential for a highway to be constructed through the center of the reserve. A clear cut was made a few years ago to accommodate the proposed southern leg of the Bennington bypass. At this point, the project is on hold for financial reasons, but if it were to happen, the One World Conservation Center would be destroyed. So the role of interpretation is critical in engaging visitors as invested supporters, protectors, and stewards of this remarkable conservation property. My final slide shows a table that lists themes or programs on the left axis, and along the top row lists the various modes of interpretation that can be utilized for each of them. The subjects range from quite specific, for example, seasonal flora like spring ephemeral wildflowers, to broad topics that can be interpreted in many ways, like climate change. Some programs would be conducted in the reserve and others in the education center. Most have aspects that could be explored in more than one venue. For instance, the Kettle Pond, which could be part of a site tour or even a vernal pool tour, and also be connected to an exhibition in the center about the history of the pond and its evolution from a glacial kettle to a dry sheep paddock and eventually into the Buttonbush Basin swamp that it is today. The chart lists multiple levels of interpretation that will encourage visitors to explore the habitats as well as the resources in the education center. Some limited signage in the reserve will point out these connections. In some cases, we hope to utilize technology like smartphone apps and interactive computer programs to provide information on aspects of the reserve that may be linked to specific online activities. The discovery packs exist already and allow visitors to take equipped backpacks into the reserve to explore a variety of themes like birds, amphibians, or mammals. Hopefully, this complex, layered approach to interpretation will help alleviate the issues related to the division of reserve and education center as well as enable us to create a comprehensive and consistent slate of programs that will encourage visitors of all ages and backgrounds to explore the reserve, to return often, and to become invested as stewards and supporters of the conservation initiatives we are engaged in at One World Conservation Center. This chart will be used as an ongoing planning and fundraising tool with the hopes of obtaining the financial resources to increase staff and train interpreters. So that is my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening.